Oh, hello. Welcome everybody to the Transhumanism session. We're going to talk about a variety of things, and I will struggle to keep everybody on track, and that should succeed for probably about 15 minutes, after which we'll do what most panels do and wander far afield and into more interesting areas. We've got some other panelists here who probably have their own slants on transhumanism. And I will start by letting them, starting with Phoebe, talking about who you are, what you've done, and what you think you can contribute to the conversation. Then we'll go to Anne, and then finally Tom, and finally me, where I'll brag a bit. Okay, you want to start, Phoebe?
All right, thanks. So I'm Phoebe Barton. I'm a queer trans science fiction author. I've had a lot of publication, mostly in short science fiction, places like Analog and Lightspeed. And recently, my interactive fiction game, The Luminous Underground, came out and is currently a finalist for the Nebula in Best Game Writing. And thanks. And in terms of what I can bring, I feel like being trans myself, I have a very particular perspective in regard to transhumanism, just because, well, like the word trans is in both of them, but a big part of transhumanism is the idea of changing or modifying yourself to more closely resemble how you want to be able to interact with the world. And that is something I have direct personal experience with. And it's a very particular flavor. So like everyone has their own insights into transhumanism, but I think that it really does depend on how you're originating, where you're observing from is going to affect what you can observe of the whole.
Thank you, Phoebe. Anne?
Hi, so I'm Anne Gray. I'm a con runner and a systems design engineer. A bunch of my work has been in government research, including some far future DARPA project and a bunch of command and control of unmanned assets. So one of the various things that I've done was I actually chaired the first convention that John Scalzi attended as a published writer, and subsequently John and I became friends, and I then ended up consulting for him to help him imagine how his external / internal brain pals would work for his Old Man's War book, The Ghost Brigades, since I had done a lot of research into military command and control and system, awareness, spatial awareness, situational awareness. And I myself am a little bit of a cyborg. I just recently started being more so. Besides having glasses, which I see Phoebe also does, I just recently started having to have hearing aids. So I'm adjusting to having glasses are glasses. You either have them on or off, basically, although I guess some of them these days change, especially based on light, or have bifocal capabilities. But my hearing aids, I can reset the settings quite a bit and do so from an app on my phone. And I can even hand my phone to somebody far away from me to be a microphone to talk directly into my ears and stuff like that. So it's been kind of fun. Becoming a bit more of a cyborg on that. But I also read lots of science fiction and have some specific things to talk about once we get in the mix.
Thank you, Anne. Tom?
I'm Tom Doyle. I am the author of the American Craftsman trilogy from Tor Books, which is magician, soldiers, and psychic spies, and not really intersected with this topic, but I have written a lot of short fiction about transhumanism, and Also, my most recent novel, Border Crosser, is a psychological space opera, and it involves a secret agent who is in a post-singularity world where the singularity kind of went hard, went bad, and now there's a lot of tension between the integrity of the individual and their choices about what alterations they want, and various groups who would attempt to exploit individuals and compel them to certain choices. And that's also a theme in my short fiction, where there are these technologies, and it seems that it's all the more important to make those alterations the individual's choice and not have them be, particularly as some of them are very intimately connected with our consciousness and such, that there's no space, including brain space, that a corporation wouldn't want to advertise in, and that is the basis of one of my stories. So that's the theme I'm interested in. I'm also interested in the theme of I've written about the similarities of the rhetoric about the singularity and the rhetoric of premillennialist Christian apocalyptic, and how they in fact follow the same rhetorical strategies in making their arguments about the future.
Thank you, Tom. I see that the number of participants in this thing have finally reached the limit. So for that, I'll start giving the description of this panel, and then I'll introduce myself, and then we'll just open the floodgates to comments. The description is that as we imagine the ways technology will change the way we define ourselves, science fiction and fantasy and horror are uniquely capable of asking, what is human? What are some of the major works in the transhuman genre, and how has the movement evolved with changing visions of the future? Okay, so we're going to be talking about the evolutionary change of human. We're going to talk about the mechanical changes of human, and we're going to talk about the attitudinal or social changes of human. So on those three things. And I've written pieces in all of those on there. I appear most frequently in Analog. I've sold about 80 or 90 stories to them over the last few years. I've got about 3 or 4 novels that are floating around. I got one that's coming out probably next year or the following year. So I'm not a new guy at this game, so I'm going to let you people do most of the talking on this. So what do we start with? We start with philosophy, social changes, mechanical changes, or evolutionary changes. Anybody want to start?
Well, I mean, we can start with just technical changes. A lot of the stuff that was science fiction, as far as these sorts of things go in the last few decades, we are, whether you're a singularity skeptic or not, seem to be entering a phase of more and more rapid change and abilities. I've visited and talked about the various sorts of DARPA projects and such. I've visited the APL, Johns Hopkins APL, and seen, the non-classified bits of work they're doing with prosthesis, with the ability to connect, the brain to the outside world in new ways. And it's extraordinary. These things were completely the subjects of science fiction, and now we are within reach of many amazing things. So technically, and we are, there are people who are getting very serious about one of the biggest transhuman goals, which is the elimination of aging, and thereby, a sort of practical, a longevity that in practical terms is kind of immortality. I mean, you don't thereby eliminate getting totally squished like a bug or our earth burning up or whatever, but people living centuries is now, something that you could look at maybe today's grandkids or whatever being ratcheted up by those technologies as they come online and living for centuries, assuming we, don't screw up the world totally. So, and that's a huge transhuman moment. In
Yeah,
terms of philosophically.
hard science fiction is focused pretty much on technophilia, mechanical changes to the human person. I'm thinking of McClellan's Upload or Strauss's Expellerano. And then there's a whole host of stories on cyber whatever's out there. So you take your choice. Anybody want to weigh in on the evolutionary side?
Well, in terms of, because I know biotech has become, the idea of biotech has become a lot more popular in terms of, as something to explore, and also in terms of technology and science are starting to approach those boundaries. But then there are a lot of really thorny ethical issues that crop up when you look at that, because the whole thing of like mechanical transhumanism is one thing, because like installing parts in yourself, but biotechnological transhumanism can very easily and very quickly cross a line into eugenics, and that is something that has caused incredible destruction and devastation, and is extremely negative. So, and I feel like there's, it's just, we can't lose sight of the ethical issues and those sort of philosophical issues before, rather than focusing entirely on the technological issues, the whole Jurassic Park argument, like could versus should, because there's a difference between making like upgrading yourself in a way that is just affecting yourself versus upgrading yourself in a way that gets transmitted to any children you have. And it's like, they didn't ask to be transhuman. So there are a lot of ethical issues that come up when you approach it from that angle.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you look at it from like a purely evolutionary stance. I mean, they estimate that about 25% of longevity is based on genetics as we experience it right now. And of course, we have seen works in the past, like Heinlein's Methuselah's Children, that suggested there might be people in our society even now that are genetically biased toward living tremendously long and not suffering the breakdowns in function or the changes in function that we normally associate with aging. I think that's interesting. I certainly think, like I know I and thousands, possibly millions of us in the United States are descended from Priscilla Allen, who came over in the Mayflower, and she lived to be in her 90s. And, so like between 1600 and now, for instance, like the average period of life has certainly gone way up, but the late stages, like how long the oldest people have lived, hasn't changed in a while, as far as we know, really substantially. We're studying it a lot right now, and we're making some real progress in like mice, but not necessarily in humans yet. But in terms of the science fiction, I think one of the most interesting things is that these days, especially as more women get involved in writing, but also just I think as we engage with the question, people are starting to write about what it really means to be older, as far as both advantages and disadvantages and just the changes of life, right? Like in terms of, for instance, women who've experienced menopause are no longer going to be potentially getting pregnant, and how the changes in hormones, we're only just starting to understand the changes in or what hormones even do, especially interacting with our cognitive systems, in the body. But I wanted to mention Holy Fire by Bruce Sterling. It was a while since I read it, but he talks about, you know, a gerontocracy where older people have such an advantage over younger people in terms of their influence in society, but also, like, you can tell if they don't do a really good job of trying to hide it, the people who are older, because among other things, you learn a certain finesse of movement, basically, that will come through, like, unless you have a disease, obviously, that makes you lack that. But you know, you just keep learning things about how to hold yourself and how to move through space that will show if you're a really old person. And the idea of gerontocracy, like right now, as our average age is getting longer, I feel like we're facing it right now, even in the US, where we're looking around and going, oh, well, you know, the power structures haven't changed that much, perhaps from, for instance, before the civil rights movement made a lot of progress, because a lot of the people who are still in power were already in power then, and they're still in power now. They're just really old.
Should note that the increase in the lifetime age of human beings has increased because of the decrease in child death.
Mhm.
The people lived in their 90s in ancient Greece. Not many, but and there are a lot more chances to get killed or die anyway. The thing that hasn't touched is how transhumanism would change people socially. I'm thinking of Beggars in Spain by Nancy Kress, where they basically had people who never slept, and Childhood's End, where there was a actual transformation of the human race. Or I guess the same thing was happening More Than Human by Sturgeon. At the end of it, that people get up. And that brings us back to Tom's mention of the singularity. Who's it? Kurzweil is the one that says singularity happens when we upload our brains to the computer.
He's a big advocate. He's a big master of the idea, and he's got a lot of the rhetorical problems that it's always been 30 years off with him.
Yeah, I think in Beggars of Spain, you have the same sort of situation you see in Methuselah's Children, where, you know, the people who don't have to spend that 8 or 9 hours or whatever it is sleeping, everybody else starts to feel like it's unfair for them to be able to engage in competition with the humans that don't have those abilities.
And with long life, where death becomes less of an issue, I don't think a lot of the narratives we have become completely, in our culture right now, become irrelevant to a group of the extremely long-lived. That a lot of, and you see this in moments in ancient, you know, this was understood even in ancient mythology when people thought about the gods, and say Odysseus interacting with Athena, and, you know, it's like, great, you finally get to go home. It's only been 20 years. And, you know, that sort of thing. And Odysseus is like, you have no clue, do you? You have no idea what mortal life means, and what 20 years of a mortal life means. And I think you would see that death, the idea of death is so essential in a lot of ways to our culture that that would be if there is a point where you start talking post-human instead of transhuman, that would be a threshold, besides the obvious ones of extremely different consciousness. And that one the extremely different consciousness actually scares me, because we don't really understand human consciousness right now. And yet we are going to be on the threshold of doing things both potentially genetically and cybernetically, that will alter the nature of that consciousness in the name of certain skills. And whether those, what gets lost during that, we wouldn't necessarily know, because we don't really have a good grasp of it now.
I think one of the things that people have to have considered in something, I think it was Robson, is people who have the expectation of extremely long life can make long-term decisions and thereby acquire wealth and power over the time. We haven't discussed that aspect. But long-lived people are going to acquire material things and big bank accounts.
Well, one thing I wanted to just add to this that spins off what you were saying as well, Bud. And in regards to what's being said in the chat, like people would care a lot more about the environment and clean tech if they were going to live 1,000 years. Just in regard to transhumanism, just because I see that sentiment posed a lot, but I don't know how accurate it really is, just because it all really depends on what kind of social imperatives and what kind of rewards society is offering. Because it can be argued we are living in a world dominated by a very long-lived transhuman organisms right now. They're called corporations, but they are incentivized to plan for only the very specific short term, even though a corporation is, in theory, immortal. Even though that I think there are very few that last more than 200 years, but even so, like we do have a not necessarily a metaphor, but something in the same kind of category. And it's just like
incentivized toward constant growth as well right now.
Yeah. So it's like so much of it really depends on external incentives and conditions, and things that might seem logical from an outside perspective are not logical to them because of the incentives that they are pursuing.
The Altered Carbon books had the group of the extremely long-lived, and they were both extremely prosperous, but but the technology wasn't really amplifying their brain capacity. It was, amplifying their lives and the ability to continue their consciousness.
Aren't they switching bodies in Altered Carbon?
They're switching bodies, but keeping the same consciousness, and and their brains do seem to get stale, as far as the way they look at the world and relate to it, so combining that with the sense of elite privilege, it is not a good ruling class in that scenario. It's clear they are not and the sort of counter movement that's going on against the technology is basically because of what that class has become.
The tendency to be conservative. You see that also in The Summer Prince by Elia Dawn Johnson, which is an excellent book.
Oh yeah, that was good.
Yeah. I forget where it was, but I remember something from a book. I can't think of who wrote it, but he made a comment in there that has stuck with me over the years. We said, you think you would be wealthy and have a great deal of influence if you lived forever. Tell me something. How early did you sell that Apple stock when it started to slide? How long has it been since you bet correctly on a horse race or a baseball game? You're not going to change your personality. You're still going to screw up. You're still going to be short term. You're still going to make all the mistakes that a human being makes in the course of their life. And just because you're living a lot of years doesn't mean that you're going to make fewer. You probably invent new ways to make mistakes. but that's off the subject.
Well, you have, yeah, as an engineer, I'll just say you have to make mistakes in order to learn, right? It's a question of, do you learn from your mistakes?
Yes. Phoebe, you were going to say something?
Not right then.
Oh, okay. And Tom always has something to say.
Well, I mean, in terms of that, though, there are just steady economic factors like the accumulation of property, et cetera, in our world, which if you're not expiring and you don't blow it all at the racetrack or whatever, that will accrue wealth. You know, if you're hanging on, if your property is not, you know, going to others when you die, or even, I mean, even we're seeing when it does, if it sticks within the same family or a narrow line, there's steady capital accumulation. So you don't have to be even the brightest bulb if you're living long, and to have a steady accumulation of wealth vis-a-vis those who are not living a long time. And if you start off in the elite, which is the group that would most likely have start with the technologies to live longest, then the imbalance becomes pretty dramatic, perhaps.
But then perhaps interfered with by revolutions.
Yes, well, that's the thing. You know, and does it come to that point? And is the technology forced to be shared with all or not at all?
Well, I think one of the things that, and the thought just went completely out of my head. I'm sure that's never happened to anybody.
Well, I was going to mention earlier, I mean, we do see to a certain extent in human development that right now, at least as we've understand how the brain develops and works, that we don't really start to have long range thinking until we're at least like in our 20s, most of us, maybe as late as 28. But that doesn't mean you get more so after that point.
And at 16, you're immortal.
Yeah. I'm going to plug a book on the topic of the relationship of religion to kind of transhuman technologies, which is, it's called The Religion of Technology by, I think the name is David Noble, last name Noble. And it talks about how the origins of Western science in a Christian context has led to a sort of technology that is about, you know, oriented to an elect, kind of returning to a, you know, Adamic perfection and perhaps ascending from the planet. And a lot of sort of ideas of transhumanism actually have this sort of religious origins that come from where science came from in our culture. And it's a consistent sort of story. And it is biased towards an elect, towards a male elect. And you see that in a lot of the transhuman literature. And it's so it's interesting to look at. I'm sure there are arguments against it, but you know,
I wanted to dig into the Q&A a bit because there are a couple of questions looking at uploading as regards to transhumanism, which is another common way of addressing it. Like you was mentioned about Ray Kurzweil earlier, and just the idea of uploading yourself, giving up your body, becoming a living digital entity. And I think there's so many just issues and circumstances with thinking that. I know it's a very thorny philosophical problem, but it's just, I don't consider it to be the same. It's like all part of transhumanism, but not part of the same, not in the same jar as like augmenting yourself biologically or mechanically, because I guess there are really two ways to kind of make to upload yourself into a computer, like one that either destroys your brain or does not destroy your brain. So in the first case, it's like slicing your brain into however many thin as necessary chunks so that it can be scanned at the resolution necessary to transfer that information. What that feels to me, though, is like that's always been the issue of like, isn't that really just teaching a computer how to think like you? And because if you are not destroying the brain, you're creating another individual that has its own separate chain of consciousness existing at the same time as the original. And that also, there's also the question of like I guess it is an open question whether or not what kind of computational structure can host a sapient intelligence. Like it's like you can't make a brain out of wood, for example. So like we know that it is possible to make a brain out of electrified jelly because that's what's talking right now. But it is like it's an additional question to the whole transhumanist issue, because when it comes to mechanical or biological augmentation, we know these things are possible. Some of these things are doable right now in limited degrees, but something like longevity by turning into a digital being may not even be possible.
One of the things that problems I have with the uploading idea is that computer clock speeds are not the speed of life. Suppose you get transported into there and 20 seconds later, somebody says, okay, now I'll talk to the digital being. And you find to that individual that several years have passed since they got uploaded, because they're working on a very faster clock speed than you are. So what happens to if two people decide they're going to be reunited digitally after one of them passes? And then when the second one arrives in the digital world, find out that their eternal partner has had 16 wives before her. So, it's an issue that I think could write a very humorous short story about. But as a matter of fact, I think I will.
There's a lot of looking into that. There is on YouTube, the YouTuber Tom Scott, I think back in 2012 or so, did a video which is basically called the Singularity Ruined by Lawyers, and it's like an angle that I hadn't seen approached in stories very much, but felt a lot more realistic. Just because I feel like it's something I come up against a lot in science fiction. First, the people who are speculating about this think of a lot of times it feels like a lot of things are conceived in isolation, and it's only until versions of these things start entering the world that more angles start coming. I mean, like nobody really thought about digital rights management, for example, before it wasn't as common a thing before it started happening in reality. And so this video is like a very strong it's about maybe 4 or 5 minutes long, very, very transhumanist, but it's about how you're on death, you're uploaded to this computerized afterlife realm that has multiple tiers based on how much you can pay. And the lower tiers you are, the more you're not able to think about things, the more that it has a thing about copyrighted materials and memories being deleted unless you pay licensing fees, that sort of thing. So
the show Upload has that kind of thing too, different tiers.
Yeah. And that gets back to when you start talking about IP in the brain, that again is that problem of, the integrity of the person and those alterations vis-a-vis the sorts of commercial and other forces that would want to, get into that space to get it.
Yeah,
Um,
but when you mentioned your scenario, I was just like, well, and do you have a record of everything that that person has done in that virtual space, including their brain, in which case maybe their partner would just want you to spin off a copy of who that person was a few minutes after they got uploaded, and then they can go off in another universe and
oh, yeah.
reunite with them.
And you were saying about the importance of bodies in this. So any simulation is, if supposing you can do, an upload of, the consciousness, fully conscious human, and have it be human-like there. To be really human-like, a brain needs to be situated in a simulated or other body,
Yeah.
that we are much more attached
Well,
to,
yeah.
we are a series of chemical functions that are going on all through us, our guts, our endocrine systems, all that needs to be part of the package,
Yeah.
versus a sort of just, not just the brain in the vat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's some like just to add to that, like you wouldn't be able to just like simulate the brain. You would have to like simulate hormones because like I have very personal experience of how much my thought process changed, how much so many things changed when the hormones I was subject to changed as well.
Like,
And it
who do you
was,
find
yeah,
pleasure in living if we don't
and
have
it,
hormones and pheromones and all that sort of stuff?
well, it's just it was just like I hadn't expected it to that degree, but it just really shows that like well, like the brain is a chemical machine, and how much like how subject it is to those inputs. Like, cause it's like I think Steven said in the chat, like what if things like intelligence and self-awareness are emergent properties of the electrified jelly? And like that is a distinct possibility that there is something about the qualities of a meat brain that couldn't be replicated in a computer the same way that you could not make a functioning 747 out of paper mache.
Well, and I think it's also important to remember that those things might vary according to different peoples on the planet as well. Some of that could be genetic, some of that could be environmental, some of that could be cultural. As a human factors engineer who has studied cognitive ergonomics, we've had a variety of models, especially in the Western world, of how the brain works, how human perception works. And just recently, as translators, automatic translation and stuff has made international studies a little bit more approachable, we've started to learn that many of the assumptions that we had were wrong, like not generalizable. For instance, there were conclusions that we made about how we perceive distance as you move through your environment. Most human perceptions of our environment, things like, can I pass through that space, or can this hold me, are based on moving through your environment. You move back and forth and you see, oh, this object is front of that object, that sort of thing, right? So they had this idea that, one of the things probably all of us on this call not necessarily consciously understand is that when two parallel lines are converging, the thing where those parallel lines seem to look closer together is farther away from us. So when we're driving along and we're seeing parallel lines pass, that's part of how we can tell how fast we're going, but that's part of how we can tell how far away something is, right? And that seems very normal, and that's part of the basis of how certain visual illusions work on us, is because that seems to be wired into our brains and our perception of distance and movement. But it's only true for people who have grown up around buildings and roads that are in straight lines.
Somebody in the chat has just mentioned the fact that reminded me of Fred Poole's story, Day Million, which was a delightful little short piece that everybody ought to read. And the thing that strikes me is that almost everything in that story is now exists or is on the drawing board right now. It's very hard. The point it made, though, I think it gets back to something we were talking about earlier, Ann, is that human lifetimes are extremely too short for us to really notice evolutionary changes happening to ourselves.
Mm.
You know, take a look at our bodies right now. Your nose. Isn't it strange that your nose is the same size as the end of your index finger? You know, that's not an accident. That's not an accident. And there's a lot of other little things that.
Your foot is the same distance as here to here, I believe. You know,
Yeah. So human beings are changing on the evolutionary stair, but the changes are too slow for us to really take much notice of. And aside of the old mutation idea in a lot of the early science fiction stories, it's kind of based on faulty biology.
There's someone in the Q&A was asking about what happens to the non-augmented and the social structure and etc. I'm very cynical these days about what an augmented elite armed with AI means of production, etc. I think the elite has shown a very all too easy disposition to let a massive die-off happen or even egg it along. That the last year has shown a very marked unconcern for the deaths of hundreds of thousands that could easily become a very marked unconcern for the deaths of millions or even billions by those people.
On the
Well,
other
and
hand, we already are augmented. I can jump in a car and drive for miles and miles and miles. I can jump on a plane and go around the world. I can talk to people around the world in an instant. I have powers that are godlike to most of our ancestors.
yeah. Well, I was going to add, we might also end up with clusters of poor augmented laborers who have taken on augmentations. I mean, of course, a classic one in science fiction is people who end up being genetically altered in order to be able to work in space, and then they can never come back to Earth. But we might be augmented to work undersea or on land, but without the same normal amounts of oxygen or facing greenhouse gases or whatever, like there's all
for military purposes is the other common one. Spacefarers and military. Yeah.
Yeah, like Spider Robinson's quaddies, for example.
Right.
Yeah, I think, and in terms of like, especially when you're looking at it from the eugenics angle, like it's like a question of like, what are you attempting to accomplish here? Is it like, are you trying to add something on that doesn't exist, or are you trying to remove something that you believe should be removed? And that's like, it's two very different things. Like making like the idea of, say, engineering people so that they have greater resistance to radiation is one thing, but removing something is an entirely different ethical quandary. And I think that's not even the strongest word for it. It is like that's what eugenics was built around, like removing qualities from people. And it's
Well, and removing people.
removing people from the gene pool.
Yeah.
Just certain people.
Yeah.
Just lesser people.
Yeah.
Not even people, really.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the way they think. Yeah.
That's the way they think. Yeah.
So we are at the 5-minute mark, I guess.
mm-hmm.
Yes. We've gone all around this thing. We've talked about the philosophical, social, mechanical, and evolutionary aspects of transhumanism. Have we really touched on anything that's really relevant to today's world that
Well,
we
when you
can-
were talking about prosthetics and stuff, I mean, certainly a lot of medical cyborgs now, people, and even we run into questions like, oh, well, if somebody has prosthetic legs and feet, are they allowed to enter races with other people, and stuff like that? But you know, all the time I hear of people who've gotten pacemakers on their heart and things like that, different
hearing aids,
devices or
glasses.
insulin pumps. Dad now has an implant that keeps track of his sugars for as a diabetic, right? Like,
Yep.
And
Uh,
the way
this
we, oh, go on, sir.
I was going to say we've got just a few minutes left. So, Tom, do you want to wrap up what you were going to say?
Yeah, I'll just say, if we're doing wrap ups, again, I'll put it's tomdoyleauthor.com. People want to, and I'll put that in the chat. Latest book is Border Crosser, which has fun with some of this stuff. Someone asked about the religious implications in the Q&A. I'll be on Discord afterwards. That's something that fascinates me, both the religious input as we go into this process and the later implications. And that's it. Thank you all for a fun panel, even at this hour.
Anne?
I like that somebody brought up near human demi-sapiens. You know, it's true that animal consciousness and human consciousness, we don't really know where the border is, and we could start having some trans cats, trans dogs,
Uplifted.
etc. Some of that's already been done in science fiction, but there's a lot of different ways that creatures could be augmented. Interesting questions. Thank you all for
Phoebe?
this conversation.
Yeah, so yeah, like pretty much everything I wanted to say has been really said. There are a lot of things to deal with, but yeah. So if anyone is interested in what I've done, like I am on Twitter at a Phoebe Barton, and my website is at phoebebartonsf.com. I'm just going to put that link in the chat.
I think the one regret I have about this session is that we can't all go to the bar and have some drinks and continue the discussion among ourselves.
But we can go to Discord and
We can
type.
go to Discord. That's true.
serve
That's true.
ourselves
If
our
it wasn't so damn late.
or ice
Thank
cream.
you all for contributing on this. I think everybody enjoyed it. We did not lose a lot of people and participants while we were doing this. So I guess that stands for something. So yay for us.
Yay for us. And we'll see you in Water Table, or if not, good night.
Good night.
All right.
Tomorrow.